So thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Bradley Monton. There should be a handout. Raise your hand if you do not have a handout. I was privy to the Facebook discussions that happened on the Facebook page leading up to this event. I noticed someone said, but Bradley Monton's in America. He's not actually going to be here talking to us, is he? And yes, here I am. I'm here talking to you. And the reason I'm here is that I'm a visiting professor for a year at Victoria University of Wellington. But I come and hang out in Auckland a lot, too. There are 4 things I want to talk about today. So this talk has 4 parts. Part 1, why am I an atheist? Not directly about intelligent design, but you'll see connections, and I think it's good to lay the groundwork. Part 2, what is intelligent design? I saw that was one of the questions that someone raised on the Facebook page, is if they wanted like a straightforward answer, and the short answer is there's not a straightforward answer. Like what the theory actually is a matter for great debate. And whether it even counts as a theory, I should say. So part 3 is intelligent design science. This is something that gets people all excised, and I'll weigh in on that. And then finally part 4, perhaps the most controversial part, what are some somewhat plausible arguments for intelligent design? I think there are some somewhat plausible arguments for intelligent design. These arguments make me less confident of my atheism than I would be had I not heard those arguments. But the arguments aren't strong enough to make me not be an atheist. So that's where I'm at. And that's where I want you to try to be at the end of this talk. So part 1, why am I an atheist? Let me consider 3 possible answers. The third answer is the answer I endorse. But I want to consider 2 other answers that I don't endorse, answers that other people would give, because I think that's kind of interesting to get different perspectives on this. You'll see what I mean in a second. So the first possible answer is an answer that some Christians would give. Specifically, the famous philosopher of religion, Al Plantinga, would give this answer. How many people have heard of Al Plantinga, by the way? Okay, good. Al and I are friends, but that doesn't stop him from saying things like, Brad, you're an atheist because you lack a properly functioning sensus divinitatis. I just realized I spelled it wrong on the handout. There should be a couple more letters in there. I spelled it wrong for years, and I finally fixed it, and I still spell it wrong. It's just a fancy term for this thought that we have this innate ability to recognize divinity in the world. Someone like Plantinga would say it's a God-given ability to recognize divinity in the world. And due to the fall or something like that, that innate ability has been corrupted by sin. And in some of us, it's more corrupted than others. Perhaps to our own sin, perhaps not. But because we lack that ability, atheists like me and some of you don't perceive God in the world the way that other people do. I think this is an important potential answer for why we're atheists to keep in mind, because it's not easily refutable, right? I look around the world, I don't see God's divine presence in the world. The people who say that make me laugh. Ha ha ha, you see God's divine presence, you're so silly. But then they tell me, no, look, there's this ability that I have more than you do. I'm sorry you don't have it the way that I do. Maybe you're more of a sinner than I am. Or maybe it's not your particular fault. Maybe it's just the general nature of there being sin in the world that leads some people to be more corrupted than others. This is an answer that we need to keep in mind, especially we atheists who go around, some atheists go around all confidently proclaiming their atheism. Maybe they're missing something. Maybe they're missing this sensus divinitatis. Let's set that answer aside. If you had asked me back when I was 14 and first became an atheist, Brad, why are you an atheist? I would have said, problem of evil. 14-year-old Bradley philosopher, doing his. And I could run the problem of evil pretty well when I was 14. And you probably know it too. Look, an all-powerful being could stop there from being evil in the world. All-knowing being would know if evil was going to occur. An all-good being wouldn't want evil in the world. But in fact, there is evil in the world. Therefore, there's no all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good being. Therefore, there's no omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. If you think of that as God, then therefore God doesn't exist. Boom. Oh, and you don't need to run the argument with evil. Evil is a really loaded term. You could just say maybe bad things happening to undeserving creatures. An all-powerful being wouldn't want bad things to happen to undeserving creatures, and so on. But bad things do happen to undeserving creatures, so there's no God. There are a number of good replies to the problem of evil, though. Well, potentially good replies. I go back and forth on this. But there are certainly replies that are better than replies There are certainly replies out there that are better than most atheists give them credit for. And let me tell you about one reply in particular that I think atheists do not give enough credit to, in part because most atheists aren't even aware of this reply. This reply is called, has a fancy name, multiverse theodicy. A theodicy is just a solution to the problem of evil. The multiverse theodicy goes like this. Look, one way of putting the problem of evil is, why didn't God create a perfect world? Why did God create this crappy world? Well, somewhat crappy world, where on occasion bad things happen to undeserving creatures. The proponent of the multiverse theodicy says, oh, God did create that perfect world, in the sense that he created a perfect universe, a perfect space-time system, full of bunnies and happy people and everything going wonderfully. He created that particular universe, that particular space-time system, and then he said, okay, God didn't really quite do this, but this is the sort of story you can tell. Then God said, that's great that there's this perfect universe out there, but I can do more. I'm an all-good being. I can do more to add to the goodness of reality. So I'm going to create another universe. And maybe I'll create some other universe that's also perfect. And I'll create another universe that's also perfect. And God creates all the perfect universes, and he's like, okay, that's great, but still I can do more to add to the goodness of reality. Why don't I create universes where there's more good than evil? Universes where there's more good than evil add to the goodness of reality. So he creates all those as well. So God creates an infinite number of universes. Some of those universes are perfect. Some aren't perfect, but they still add to the goodness of reality, and hence they're worth creating. Our universe sucks for us, just happens to be one of the imperfect ones that still adds to the goodness of reality. I'm not saying that's the right reply to the problem of evil, but I'm saying that's a prima facie promising reply that atheists don't give enough credit to. One reason I think it doesn't get discussed as much is that you would expect it to, is it's not the sort of theodicy that Christians run around giving. It doesn't really fit the Christian model. But Christians are wrong anyways. So, this is an interesting theodicy worth considering. So now when people ask me, Brad, why are you an atheist? I certainly don't tell them about my non-properly functioning sensus divinitatis, but I don't really cite the problem of evil very heavily either. The main thing I tell them is, it's a lack of evidence. Even if I lived in a world that was full of perfect happiness, bunnies running around, unicorns and rainbows, and no bad things happening to undeserving creatures, I still wouldn't believe in God, just because there's no evidence. So we live in a very nice world. That doesn't mean that there's a God out there. So that's really the fundamental issue for me. It's just a lack of evidence. There's no good reason to believe, so I don't believe. But that's what makes me so interested in the Intelligent Design Project. Because one way of thinking about the Intelligent Design Project is that they're trying to look for evidence for the existence of God or some sort of designer. And specifically, they're trying to look in the realm of science. So the intelligent design proponents are looking in the realm of science for evidence for the existence of God or some sort of designer. And that's what I find especially exciting, especially promising. If I'm going to find evidence for the existence of God, that seems like the best way to find it. I know people have spiritual experiences and stuff like that. I'm skeptical of those. This is something we could talk about, the different ways that one could get evidence for God. For me, this seems like the most promising way. Okay, so that leads to the question, what actually is this Intelligent Design Project? I've described it vaguely as getting scientific evidence for the existence of God or some sort of intelligent designer, but you've probably heard other characterizations as well. And you've probably heard characterizations like this one. This is the characterization by Barbara Forrest, who's a prominent intelligent design critic. And she says, the ID movement is the most recent version of American creationism in promoting intelligent design theory, a term that is essentially code for the religious belief in a supernatural creator. There's her definition. As a purported scientific alternative to evolutionary theory, the ID movement continues a decades-long attempt by creationists either to minimize the teaching of evolution or to gain equal time for yet another form of creationism in American public schools. This is standard rhetoric. You've probably heard stuff like this if you've heard people talk about intelligent design. And she goes on, I couldn't resist quoting this. ID creationists continue their campaign to desecularize public education and ultimately American culture and government, thereby undermining foundational elements of secular constitutional democracy. Whew, okay. Contrast that with what the Discovery Institute, which is the main think tank that has people promoting intelligent design, what they say about it. They say, the theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. Okay, two very different accounts here of what intelligent design is all about. I think Barbara Forrest is confusing matters by mixing in what intelligent design is with what the proponents want to accomplish. We need to separate out bad people from bad arguments. Let's suppose the intelligent design proponents are trying to undermine foundational elements of secular constitutional democracy. Boo on them. That doesn't mean that the actual arguments they're giving are bad arguments. They might be giving good arguments for that bad end of undermining secular constitutional democracy. But we can put on our philosophy hat. We can put on our intelligent reasoner hat. Let's forget about whether they're trying to undermine secular constitutional democracy or not. Who cares? Who cares when you put on your hat of just trying to reason carefully and evaluate the arguments? It's like, I mean, obviously we all care, right, about secular constitutional democracy. But let's put on our philosophy hat for a little bit and forget about that and focus on the arguments. And then what I wanted us to do is set aside the cultural agenda. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Who cares for now? Certainly, if you talk to the intelligent design proponents, they say that they're not trying to do that. And there's, we could get in a whole debate about culturally what is going on. But I'm not near as interested in that debate as I am in the debate about the arguments. And I'll just focus on America. I mean, we're in New Zealand anyways, right? Focus on America should strike you as parochial. Who cares about, that country's messed up anyways. Let's focus on better, more interesting issues. Okay, but that said, so I don't like Barbara Forrest's approach. She mixes the people with the arguments. She mixes in cultural issues. And that's just a representative sample. Like, you just get so much of the criticisms of intelligent design focus on that. But the Discovery Institute statement, which doesn't talk about the people, doesn't talk about the cultural issues, it still isn't a very good statement of what they're trying to achieve. That cannot be the theory of intelligent design if you take that statement literally. And here's one reason why. The theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause. Well, I don't know. I mean, here's a feature of the universe that contains this thing. This thing, the existence of this thing is best explained by an intelligent cause. Some people in J. Roger Jenkins Limited. So, okay, that was easy, right? I just proved the theory of intelligent design just because there's a feature of the universe that's best explained by an intelligent cause. It can't be that easy. And the same with features of living things. Talia has a hole in her ear, right? Yeah. Where did that hole in her ear come from? That feature of Talia, that living thing, is best explained by an intelligent cause. Wow. I just proved the theory of intelligent design. It can't be that easy. So, what should we say the theory of intelligent design says? Maybe we need to talk about global features of the universe. And this is, in fact, when the arguments that they pull appeal to global features of the universe. Features like what the laws of physics are, what the values of the fundamental constants are. These are features of the universe that arguably hold across the whole universe. The mass of the neutron has the same value anywhere in the universe. And so if we focus on features like that, then we won't be able to get away with proving the theory so easily. So maybe we should change that statement of the theory. The theory of intelligent design holds that certain global features of the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause. And maybe instead of talking about just living things, maybe we should talk about innate features of living things, where the hole in Talia's ear isn't an innate feature of living things. Still have worries about breeding. Isn't it an innate feature of my dog that she's like super cute and fluffy and not a wolf? She's super cute and fluffy because of like intelligent breeding potentially that led to her existence. So it's tricky. In my book, I kind of go on and on about how exactly to define it. We won't do that now. You see the issues. And so when someone posts on Facebook, oh yeah, what's the theory of intelligent design? I think someone else responded with this Discovery Institute quote, which is maybe a good start, but certainly not capturing what they're trying to capture. Okay, that's just preliminary stuff. Now here's a really interesting point. the Discovery Institute statement talks about certain features of the universe being best explained by an intelligent cause. And there's something really interesting going on there. When you start thinking about best explanations, what you're doing is you're comparing different explanations, right? So we've got a number of different explanations. Maybe it was God, maybe it was a genie, maybe maybe the laws of physics are logically necessary. You look at these different possible explanations, and then you pick the best one, and you say that's the right one. And these different possible explanations are competing explanations. So when we have our list of explanations, it's not like we're saying they're all true. We're saying, look, here are these explanations that are competing, and we're going to pick the best one and say that's the right one. People argue that science works this way. Let me, you know what?
They could all be wrong.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. They could all be wrong, yeah. And maybe we should save questions till the end, because otherwise we'll just go on and on. But yeah. And I totally agree with you. They could all be wrong. And that's one of the problems with this whole reasoning in terms of explanation that I wasn't going to get into, but it's still a good problem. But here's the issue, is that we have all these competing explanations of, say, these certain features of the universe. And it may be the case that out of all those competing explanations, the best explanation is the theistic one. Maybe the best explanation does appeal to God. But nevertheless, maybe that's not the true explanation. Maybe the truth of the matter is that there's no explanation at all. So sometimes people wonder that. Why does the physical universe exist? Right? We can consider all the different reasons that there is a physical universe in existence. All the different explanations for that. Maybe the best explanation is the God one, but maybe the true account of reality is that there's no explanation at all. So, and I think that's something that atheists need to be willing, and a move that atheists need to be willing to make. Atheists need to be willing to say, I don't have an explanation for that. In fact, there is no explanation for that. So technically you're right that the best explanation is God, but that's not the truth. All these potential explanations that you're listing are all bad explanations. They're all false explanations. The right account of reality is that there's no explanation at all. So if you're the sort of atheist who believes that, so there's a big point I'm making, which is that maybe demands for explanation aren't always met, and atheists need to concede that. That's the big point, controversial point. That makes people mad when I say that sort of thing. The little point I'm making is that that view is at least a possible view to hold, this view that I just put on the table. And if you hold that view, then when you look at the Discovery Institute statement, certain features of the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause, you can recognize that for atheists like me, who have this view that maybe there's no explanation, then yeah, the Discovery Institute statement could come out true in the sense that the existence of the universe is best explained by God, but that's still a false explanation, just like all the other explanations. All the explanations are false. So it's another way that the Discovery Institute statement can come out true too easily. It can come out true too easily because of this, and can come out true too easily because of Talia's ear. It can come out true too easily because maybe the right account of reality is that there's no explanation at all. I think that's kind of a cool point. I have made people so mad with that point, though. I think I'm obviously right, but whatever. Okay. Okay, final issue I want to raise in this section. And this is a separate issue, but this gets people really excited too. This issue of whether intelligent design is inherently theistic. The intelligent design proponents, if you ask them, they'll say, no, my theory is not inherently theistic. My theory is just saying there's some sort of designer. I'm not telling you what the nature of that designer is. And people like Barbara Forrest get really mad, and they say, no, look, it's code for a religious belief in a supernatural creator. And then they say, no, we're just arguing for designer. We're not telling you the nature of that designer. And then people like Barbara Forrest say, but all you Discovery Institute people are Christians. And then they say, well, no, there's this one Jewish guy. And then you start getting down that road. But who cares, right, what the actual proponents of this intelligent design theory religiously believe? We can focus on the arguments again, and we can focus on a doctrine. Maybe some intelligent design proponents want to defend the doctrine that God is a designer, but, in principle, they could defend the existence of some other sort of designer that's not God. And in fact, there are some people who run around saying they're proponents of intelligent design and also saying that the designer is not God. The Raelians believe this. How many people have heard of the Raelians? Okay, good. I hadn't really heard of them until I started researching this stuff. The Raelians, it's some like pseudo-religious group. They believe that, they believe in, well, let's write the term down, directed panspermia. Sorry, my handwriting is so bad. Directed panspermia. So panspermia is the doctrine that life on Earth came from elsewhere in the universe. The thought is that the early conditions of the universe, the early conditions on Earth weren't suitable to the formation of life, but maybe life came from elsewhere, like on some meteor or something, and then got started on Earth that way. Francis Crick, for example, takes this doctrine seriously. The directed panspermia is, okay, maybe it wasn't a meteor, maybe it was a spaceship. Maybe the aliens on their spaceship, put life on Earth. And that's what the Raelians believe. And so the Raelians look at features of living things on Earth, and they say, oh yeah, those features are best explained by an intelligent cause. Namely, the aliens who put the life creatures on the spaceship and flew them to Earth to seed Earth. I'm not saying the Raelians have good arguments or anything, but I'm just saying that shows that in principle, you could be an intelligent design proponent in the sense that you could think that certain features of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause without thinking that's God. Okay, natural question, and someone raised this question in a related context on Facebook. You didn't know I was stalking your Facebook discussion. So someone said on Facebook, look, if you appeal to a designer, you're just pushing the argument back one step. Where did the designer come from? And for the Raelians, that's a totally good move, right? Okay, so aliens, where did the aliens come from? What brought about the aliens? Well, it raises interesting issues, because maybe the aliens had different biological features than the features that we had. Maybe the aliens' biological features actually don't scream out design the way that the intelligent design proponents argue that our biological features scream out design. Something to think about. But nevertheless, they have a point that, yeah, there is the question of where the aliens came from. Does that same question arise for those intelligent design proponents who say that God is the designer? And yeah, I want to say no. For basically big picture philosophical reasons about the nature of God. And here are two reasons that I think that God is a good stopping point in the way that aliens aren't a good stopping point for explanation. So one reason is that God has existed, well, it's a combination. Either God has existed forever, or God exists outside of time. There's a big debate in philosophy of religion about which is the right view of God. And if you have God being in existence forever and being in existence outside of time, then it doesn't cry out for a designer, the way that, for example, Raelian aliens would. The other reason I think that God is a good stopping point for explanation, potential reason, is that there's a lot of arguments in philosophy of religion, historically, that argue that God is a necessary being, that God necessarily exists. So we're not talking about some contingent feature of the universe, like there being tables and chairs or there being electrons. We're talking about something that necessarily is the case, that like the laws of logic are necessary, or like mathematical truths are necessary. If you have that view about God, then that arguably makes God a good stopping point as well, where it doesn't cry out for further explanation, the way that, for example, the Raelian aliens would. So, so I think it is legitimate to look for a designer and have that designer be God, or have the designer be something else than God. If the designer is something else other than God, then sure, you have demands for further explanation. But if the designer is God, I think that's a legitimate philosophical stopping point. Okay, part three. Part three. Is intelligent design science? You might think, gee, philosophers of science surely have been studying this question for decades. They can tell us what science is, right? They can tell us that's science, that's non-science. They can give us demarcation criteria that enable us to go out in the world and pick out which theories are scientific and which theories aren't. And that would be nice if philosophers of science had achieved such a thing, but they haven't. In fact, a lot of philosophers of science have given up on the demarcation project. It's been so intractable. And it turns out that the debates that people have end up just disintegrating into other debates, like the particular debates we'll get into about intelligent design. The point is that there's no agreed upon criterion for what counts as science and what counts as non-science. And so in a sense, I could just stop right there. I could say, you know what, it's just different people say different things, they argue back and forth, and then who really cares, it's just a label. But the label science does, have some import at least. What exactly that import is, we should think about. So I'll run through the arguments. I'll run through the discussion as to whether, why you might think that intelligent design does or doesn't count as science. But we should keep in the back of our mind that, gee, maybe this actually doesn't matter. Even though this is a debate that people get hugely excised about and spend a lot of time talking about in the literature on intelligent design. A kind of key flashpoint or key move in the recent history of intelligent design was this Dover, Pennsylvania trial. How many people know about this Dover, Pennsylvania trial? Okay, good. Yeah, most of you. So very quickly, the Dover, Pennsylvania School Board had a bunch of stupid people on it, and they said, hey, before students learn evolution in the biology classrooms in our public schools in Dover, Pennsylvania, the teacher has to read a disclaimer about how intelligent design, or how evolution is just a theory, and theories are not fact, and blah, 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 blah. And then the teacher has to say, and we're not going, the teacher said this is stupid, we're not going to do it. So then they said, okay, we'll have an administrator walk into the classroom and read the disclaimer. And then the administrator has to say at the end, and you're not allowed to talk about this disclaimer with your teacher, and then walk out. Okay. So fortunately, in this aftermath of all this, the Dover, Pennsylvania School Board people got not reelected. The pedagogy was horrible. But it also led to this court case about whether this was a violation of the American constitutional separation of church and state. Because this is a public school, right? Does having this disclaimer read about intelligent design and about how evolution is just a theory, is that violating constitutional separation of church and state in America? And this Judge Jones, ruled yes, it does. And part of his ruling was to say that intelligent design is not science. And he gave his arguments backed up by philosophers of science like Robert Pennock, who testified in the trial. And here's the summary, basically, of what people like Pennock were trying to get him to say that he did say in his decision. We find that ID fails on 3 different levels, any one of which is sufficient to preclude a determination that ID is science. They are, 1, ID violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation. 2, the argument of irreducible complexity central to ID employs the same flaws in illogical, contrived dualism that doomed creation science in the 1980s. And 3, ID's negative attacks on evolution have been refuted by the scientific community. Okay, number 1 is the most important. ID violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and preventing supernatural causation. But let's talk about 3 and 2 first before we get to number 1, the big one. So with regard to 3. ID's negative attacks on evolution have been refuted by the scientific community. Okay, that has nothing to do with whether ID is science or not. The main reason is that even if you take the result being that not just their negative attacks have been refuted, but that the ID theory itself is false, false theories are still scientific. Newton's theory of mechanics is a false theory. But we teach it in physics classroom, and we think it's a really important theory, and we think it's a scientific theory. Why is Newton's theory of mechanics a false theory? Newton's theory says that a clock at the top of a building runs at the same rate as a clock at the bottom of a building. We know that's not the case. We know that clocks in stronger gravitational fields run slower. So the clock at the bottom of the building runs slow compared to the clock at the top. Newton's theory doesn't predict that, therefore Newton's theory is false. Boom, it's easy, right? But Newton's theory is still a scientific theory. So just because the ID theory is false, that doesn't mean it's not scientific. Maybe there are other reasons it's not scientific, but you can't just make that move. So that doesn't work. Set aside 3. Okay, 2. The argument of irreducible complexity is flawed. Well, it still has the same problem. Just because it's a flawed argument doesn't mean it's not scientific. But also, there's more to intelligent design than irreducible complexity. And we'll talk about that in part 4 of this talk. Okay, so those are the preliminaries. Now, main event. This claim 1 that Judge Jones makes. ID violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation. This is the key issue. Is it a ground rule of science that you can't appeal to the supernatural? Is it a ground rule of science that you can't appeal to the supernatural? I say no. I say that's not a ground rule of science. And I'm going to try to argue why. One reason, this is point 3 on my handout, is that invoking supernatural causation doesn't violate the ground rules of science because you can use science to, in principle, get evidence of the supernatural. Whether we have or not is a whole other question. But in principle, you can use science to get evidence of the supernatural. Here's a silly example and then a more realistic example. A silly example. We use our fancy telescope technology to look at pulsars. Imagine a pulsar starts pulsing out Morse code. Like, that's weird. Or it looks like Morse code, right? And we write down the Morse code, and the pulsar says, hey, this is God. I'm talking to you via this pulsar. Don't ask me why. It's fun. Let me tell you all these things. Because I'm God, I can start telling you things. And God tells us, hey, I know you've been looking for the Higgs boson. It's actually not quite the way you think it is. If you set up experiment this other way, you'll get the result. And then they go and set the experiment the other way, and they get the result that the pulsar predicts. And then God says, and hey, there's going to be a tornado, next month in Taiwan. Watch out for it. And sure enough, there's a tornado next month. And, whatever. The pulsar goes on and on. Okay, maybe it's someone playing a trick on us. Maybe it's just a random quantum fluctuation that just happens to be pulsing out in that way. Maybe you can run the naturalistic explanations on and on. But the supernatural hypothesis should be taken seriously, I think. It would be silly for the scientists in that situation to just ignore the supernatural hypothesis. But if you follow the idea that it's a ground rule of science that you can't invoke supernatural causation, then in this talking pulsar example, you wouldn't be able to do it. You wouldn't be able to consider the hypothesis that it's a supernatural cause of the pulsar talking. And that's unreasonable. That would be silly for science to not consider that hypothesis. Okay, that's my silly example. Here's my more realistic example. A few years ago at Harvard, they did a study where they had patients who were in the hospital, divided them randomly, had some of them, the basic information was given about them to different prayer groups around the world. And so you would say, Mark P. in Boston Medical Center just had cancer surgery, and here we are in our prayer group praying for them. So for half the people, you had them prayed for in that sort of way. For the other half of people, nothing happened. Double-blind, or not double-blind, but the people who were being prayed for didn't know whether they were being prayed for or not in one version of the study. And what do you think the results were? Did the prayer help? No, it didn't. Okay, that's what we expect, or at least what I expect as a good atheist, right? But we can imagine if the study results had turned out differently. Imagine if the people who were being prayed for by Southern Baptists all recovered really fast, and everyone else, they're just normal. That gives some evidence for the prayer efficacy of Southern Baptism, which for me would give evidence that Southern Baptism might be the true religion. Not saying conclusive evidence, but some evidence, right? And as a scientist to just ignore that possibility, to say no matter what, we can't consider that supernatural hypothesis, that's a mistake. This is, I think, the key point I want to make. The key takeaway point I hope you come away with, even if you disagree with everything else. I want you to agree with this. That we shouldn't run around saying that methodological we shouldn't run around saying that naturalism is part of the methodology of science. We shouldn't try to critique intelligent design by saying that it's part of the methodology of science that you can only consider natural, non-supernatural hypotheses. This is a standard critique that people give of intelligent design. And I think it's a mistake because, well, for a variety of reasons. One is a mistake because, in fact, science can, in principle, get evidence of the supernatural. And it's because we don't see that evidence that people like me, at least, are atheists. And The other is that, well, okay, I'm jumping ahead to point 5, but let me just say it. If science follows methodological naturalism, then science isn't aiming at truth. Science is only aiming at what the naturalists would say about whatever phenomenon we're investigating. So maybe, all the evidence comes in favor of the supernatural hypothesis. Maybe people all start believing, yeah, the supernatural hypothesis is the right one. And the scientists who follow methodological naturalism are like, we can't talk about that. We can only talk about our naturalistic hypotheses. You're rendering science useless if you put it in a situation where you're ignoring the supernatural hypothesis, in a situation where people are taking that hypothesis really seriously. Now, in fact, we're not in that situation precisely because we don't see much evidence for supernatural hypotheses. The Harvard Prayer Study gave the null result, as we would expect as atheists. But we shouldn't appeal to the methodology of science to rule out intelligent design. We should look at whether the evidence is actually there or not. Let me come back to point 4. Here are the sorts of things that people who are confused about this matter say about methodological naturalism. Robert Pennock is one of them. He's a philosopher of science at Michigan State University. He was the main philosopher of science who testified at the Dover trial. And he said, and actually this is all from his book, not from the trial, because he later sort of took back some of the stuff he said in the trial. He said, well, it was just a trial situation. You need to read my book for what I really believe. I'm like, oh, okay, so you didn't really believe what you said in the trial? Okay, but let's look at the book. So this is all stuff from the book. Tower of Babel is the book. Okay, so Pennock says that here's the reason he gives in favor of methodological naturalism. He says, look, allowing supernatural hypotheses would make science too easy. And here's the quote. Allowing appeal to supernatural powers in science would make scientists' tasks too easy because one would always be able to call upon the gods for quick theoretical assistance. Indeed, all empirical investigation beyond the purely descriptive could cease, for scientists would have a ready-made answer for everything. Oh, when we did that reaction, why did it turn purple? Oh, God made it turn purple. Oh, when we collided those two particles, why did that other particle come out? Oh, God made it come out. Just say that over and over. And I guess in principle, you could be a theist and say that, but that would be just a silly thing to do. And in fact, people who are theists and scientists, and there are lots of them out there, don't say that. It would be like saying, imagine if Pennock said, look, we can't appeal to indeterminism in science. These quantum physicists who talk about indeterminism, it just makes the scientist's task too easy. Why did this thing fly up in the air and then came down? Oh, it was a chancy process, and there was a chance that was going to happen. Why did this other thing happen? Oh, it was a chancy process. There was a chance that was going to happen. I mean, in principle, you could run around saying that. Just everything's chancy. There's a chance it's going to happen. It happened. But that's just a silly way of doing science. Just because you always have the opportunity to make the appeal to, hey, it's just a chancy process, that's the way it happened, doesn't mean you're always going to make that appeal. Now, in fact, in quantum mechanics, sometimes you do just say that, and that's all you say. You say, it was a chance, why did this radioactive atom decay when it did? It was a chancy process. Just by chance, it decayed then. There's nothing more to say. You just kind of stop there as a good quantum physicist. Why did that radioactive atom decay when it did? Just did. And sure, the theistic scientists, the scientist who believes in the supernatural, might sometimes say that too. Why do we have the laws of physics we do? God made them. And they stop right there. But they don't always have to appeal to God to stop right there. Just like the quantum physicist doesn't always have to appeal to indeterminism. They just make that move sometimes, and that's okay. Pennock and other people use the phrase, it would be a science stopper. And my point is no. It doesn't at all have to be a science stopper. Okay, the other point, and this is just kind of mean of me, I guess, but I can't help it because it's just too good. Pennock says that Newton's rules of scientific reasoning don't allow appeal to the supernatural. And here's this quote. He's being kind of snide here, because he's writing from his own views about God are complicated, actually. A lot of people think he's an atheist, but if you actually ask him, he says he's not. Okay, but anyways, Here's what he says. God may have underwritten the active principles that govern the world described in Newton's Principia and the Optics, but God did not interrupt any of the equations or regularities therein. Johnson and the other creationists who want to dismiss methodological naturalism would do well to consult Newton's own rules of reasoning. Okay, how many people know that this is what's gone horribly wrong here? Newton actually did appeal to God in the course of doing science. Not just to underwrite the active principles that govern the world, not just to establish, hey, these are why the laws of physics are what they are, but Newton actually thought that God intervened in the world with regularity. There's no really good quote that exhibits exactly that, but I've kind of put this quote on the handout. The idea is that Newton thought, this quote on the handout kind of gets at it, but what I'm telling you is a standard interpretation of Newton. Ask a historian of science, they'll agree with me. Newton thought that when you have the sun and the planets in their orbit around the sun, in these roughly elliptical orbits, when you've got things like comets coming in, these comets disrupt the planetary orbits, and Newton thought that that was an unstable system. Turned out that Newton was wrong about that. But that's what he thought. He thought that this system was unstable in the sense that these comets would perturb the planetary orbits, and they wouldn't stay in their roughly elliptical motions. And Newton's solution was that, and this is the end of the quote, Newton says, look, eventually, you get these irregularities, till this system wants a reformation. And then God is able, by his will, to move the bodies, and thereby to form and reform parts of the universe. So Newton thought, you get this unstable system, eventually you're going to have to restabilize it, put it back where the planets are in their roughly elliptical orbits. God steps in and does it. I'm not saying Newton was right about that, but one, I'm saying Pennock doesn't know his history of science very well. If he says, you need to look at Newton's rules of reasoning to see why we can't appeal to the supernatural, that's not right. And two, Newton, this is maybe a little ad hominem, but it's worth keeping in mind. Newton is considered one of the greatest scientists around. And yet Newton violated methodological naturalism. So maybe it's not so bad to violate. Okay, part 4. I have 8 arguments here. This is the sort of thing where one could write a book about any of these 8 arguments, and some of these have had books written about them. So let me, I'm just going to say selective things about each one, and then we can come back to them in Q&A. So the most famous argument nowadays for intelligent design is the irreducible complexity argument. This is the argument given by Michael Behe in his famous book, Darwin's Black Box. You probably know this argument. The idea is that some biological systems are irreducibly complex in the sense that they need all their parts in order to function at all. In such systems that need all their parts in order to function at all, it's very unlikely, so Behe says, that such systems would arise via unguided evolutionary means, because you can't have a stepwise evolutionary process that gives rise to such systems. The bacterial flagellum is a standard example of such a system. This quickly gets into complicated speculative biology, and we won't get into the details of that here. But one of the replies, one of the issues that gets discussed in this discussion of the irreducible complexity argument is the issue of how, look, the biological systems aren't perfectly functioning. And if they aren't perfectly functioning, then we shouldn't expect there to be a designer. And this is one of the issues that came up on the Facebook page. Someone quoted a YouTube video by, I'm blanking on his name, is it Neil deGrasse Tyson? Is that how you say it? Neil deGrasse Tyson, thanks, yeah. Okay, so someone... Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Yeah. Okay, Neil deGrasse Tyson, thank you. Neil deGrasse Tyson had this video where he called it, it's not intelligent design, it's stupid design. And he basically gives this argument that, look, living systems are designed so imperfectly. For example, like babies get leukemia. And a designer wouldn't design the world that way. And so I think that's an interesting point to consider. But it's worth noting that that actually doesn't have any impact on the irreducible complexity argument. you could say, look, there are these biological systems that are, you wouldn't expect to arise via evolutionary means, but you would expect to arise if there was a designer who wanted there to be life, without also adding the hypothesis that the designer wanted perfectly functioning biological creatures. Because I agree, the evidence is that there's not perfectly functioning biological creatures. But it's one thing to get evidence that there's a designer. It's another thing to get evidence that there's a perfect designer. Or sorry, a designer that wanted perfectly functioning creatures. We can get evidence that there's a designer without getting evidence that there's a designer that wanted perfectly functioning creatures. So those are two separate issues. And I feel like people like Neil deGrasse Tyson push those issues together and say, look, if we're not getting evidence for the perfect designer, therefore we're not getting any evidence for a designer. And that doesn't follow. Just because we're not getting evidence from a perfect designer, we could very well still be getting evidence for a designer. And then you might say, well, but wait, why would the designer make the imperfect world? Make the imperfect creatures? But that relates back to the problem of evil issue that we talked about. Why is there an imperfect world? Why didn't God create a perfect world? There are a variety of replies you can give to that. The one that I talked about was a multiverse theodicy reply. There are others you give too. But the point is that just because you can't argue that, just because there's not evidence that there's a perfect designer, it doesn't follow that there's not evidence for a designer. But that said, it's really interesting that the proponents of intelligent design do sometimes talk as if they want the designer to be pretty darn good. One thing they say, for example, is they say they want the designer to be such that there's no junk DNA. That all the DNA in humans, at least, has a function. And sometimes people say that the intelligent design proponents don't make any predictions, that intelligent design isn't open to empirical test. But here's a prediction that intelligent design proponents made. Jonathan Wells wrote his book, The Myth of Junk DNA, in 2011. And he said, nope, no junk DNA. I predict that the designer wouldn't want there to be junk DNA, and I predict that if we look, all this DNA that people are calling junk DNA actually will turn out to have a function, a biological function. 1 year later, that's pretty much what was discovered. At least, I mean, that's too strong, of course. But what was discovered is that a lot of the DNA that people thought was junk DNA turns out to have a function. Not all of it, but a lot more of it. And that was a major scientific breakthrough. So, obviously we get actually, I couldn't. Obviously, some of you could get into the details of the biology. That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that sometimes people accuse intelligent design proponents of not making predictions. And they say, look, part of what you do when you do science is you make predictions, and the intelligent design people don't make predictions. But here's a prediction that was made. No junk DNA. That was partially confirmed by the new evidence. Okay. The origin of life argument. This one doesn't get as much play as the irreducible complexity stuff. I think it should. I think it's a really interesting argument. The idea is that the transition from non-life to life is highly improbable given atheism. Why would you expect life creatures to just spontaneously arise? But that's highly probable given theism, or given a designer who wants there to be life. One reason I think this one's so interesting is that it gets away from the evolution debates. Evolutionary theory doesn't at all account for the transition from non-life to life. Evolutionary theory only comes into play once you have, fitness, natural selection, environmental pressures, that sort of thing. But just the transition from non-life to life, that's just something that's somehow happened, and we don't know how it happened. If you're a theist, of a certain stripe at least, you have an easy answer for how that would. You can have an easy answer. Not a full answer. You can say God did it. God ensured that it would happen. But that still leaves lots of the science open. Like, where did it happen? How did it happen? Did God just put living creatures ex nihilo on the planet? Or did God just encourage things to go a certain way? So it's not a science stopper, but it is something that you would think God would ensure to happen. I think the best is an atheist. The response that I want to give to this is a response that I think people don't take seriously enough. The response I want to give is that, look, there's a lot of evidence from physics that the universe is spatially infinite. And if the universe and matter exists throughout the spatially infinite universe. So that means we have an infinite number of planets. With an infinite number of planets and sufficient variability across the initial conditions, sufficient variability across what's going on in these different planets, then no matter how improbable it is for life to arise from non-life on a particular planet, as long as that probability isn't absolutely zero, then you would expect it to happen with certainty somewhere in the universe. In fact, you would expect it to happen, sorry, I should have said with probability 1. You should expect it to happen with probability 1 somewhere in the universe. In fact, you should expect it to happen with probability 1 in an infinite number of places in the universe. And so that, I think, is the best move that the atheist should make to this origin of life from non-life question. Appeal to the spatially infinite universe. A lot of people don't like that move. I think it's great. Okay, the fine-tuning argument. Here, wait, how many people know about this argument, roughly? Okay, yeah, it's all of you. This relates to the Neil deGrasse Tyson video as well, because he said, oh, look, you say that there's a designer, but look how hostile the universe is to us. In most places in the universe, we would just die right away. And I think he's being unfair. He's missing something, that the universe is hostile to our existence in that sense. But in another sense, the universe isn't hostile to our existence at all. In the other sense, in the sense that the values of the fundamental constants are such that they allow for a universe with embodied life to exist at all. You change some of these fundamental constants a little bit, and you get a universe where you just have neutron stars and black holes, and nothing else in the universe but neutron stars and black holes. And you're not going to have embodied life in that sort of universe. Or you change the constant a little bit another way, and you're not going to have any hydrogen in the universe. And you're certainly not going to have life of the sort that we're familiar with, life based on hydrogen atoms, like we are in the universe. And so, yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson is right that in the actual universe that we're in, many parts of it are inhospitable to life. But for some of these fundamental constants, you change the value at all, or sorry, change the value a little bit, and you get a universe that's not at all hospitable anywhere in the universe to life. You get a universe with just neutron stars and black holes. There's a lot I can say about that, but let me save it for Q&A. The Kalam cosmological argument, there's this worry that there's evidence from physics that the universe began to exist. And then if that's the case, what caused the beginning of the universe? Arguably, it can't be something inside the universe, so it's something outside the universe. And that something is God. This is an interesting argument, where again, you're appealing to some evidence from physics to provide evidence for the existence of God, namely that the universe began to exist. Okay, those are the 5 main ones. But let me mention 3 other ones that are different and raise some interesting issues and are kind of fun. There's this argument called the simulation argument. And this is an argument now for a non-theistic designer. The idea is that, look, if there are many civilizations in the universe, and some of these civilizations are long-lasting and super intelligent, they're going to develop the computational power to run civilization simulations. And those civilization simulations could be sophisticated enough that they simulate in detail what's going on in the brains of the creatures in these universes. And if the computer simulation simulates the brain processes in enough detail, then that would give rise to consciousness, given certain assumptions about how philosophy of mind works, at least. So you just have these like some kid on his PlayStation 17 is playing like Sims 32. And the way Sims 32 works is that it simulates brain processes within the computer in a detailed enough way that gives rise to consciousness. That gives rise to a creature saying, hey, look, I'm in this world having fun. Going to water my plants now, like you do in Sims. So the point is that if they have enough computing power, then they would run lots of, you can imagine some civilizations that would run lots of civilization simulations in such a way that the vast majority of observers would be products of simulations and not actually physically embodied in reality in the way that we think that we are. a number of steps to that argument, but the conclusion is that we're probably living in a computer simulation. Now, there's a designer then. The designer isn't God. The designer is a kid playing his PlayStation 17. And it's interesting to think about. We can talk about this in Q&A. What sort of empirical evidence we could get for that? I think we could get empirical evidence for that. Okay, consciousness is a vexing issue. I'll put that on the table. Just that, look, I think it's a real mystery why there's conscious experience at all. I can understand how, on an atheistic framework, you give rise to physical creatures moving around in the way that we're moving around, and mouths moving in the way that my mouth is moving. But I don't understand how, given an atheistic universe, there can be qualia is the technical term that philosophers use, but phenomenal fields, like something that is like to be a part of this universe. When we think about a table, we normally think that there's nothing that is like to be a table. There's no phenomenal field associated with being a table. There's no consciousness that a table has. And yet, but a different arrangement of particles somehow gives, like this arrangement of particles, somehow gives rise to these phenomenal fields. It's something that it's like to be a creature in the universe. I find that extraordinarily mysterious. Theists have a good explanation for that, namely that the fundamental thing in reality is mental, namely God. And so, of course, you would expect the mental as a fundamental part of reality in what we experience. And yeah, let me give the dimensionality argument, and then I'll stop there, because I think this one's really interesting. The question is, why are there 3 dimensions of space? Theists have a good explanation of that. The atheists don't. So a theist, well, we can dispute this, but here's the sort of thing a theist would say. A theist could say, look, God wants embodied conscious agents, and God wants a simple, elegant universe. You can't have embodied conscious agents with just 2 dimensions of space. You just have like triangles and circles running around in your 2 dimensions of space. That doesn't give rise to embodied conscious agents. But if you go from more than 3 spatial dimensions, if you go for 4 spatial dimensions, in which I mean creatures spread out through those 4 spatial dimensions, the laws of physics get much more complicated in 4 or more spatial dimension universes. So if the goal is to have embodied conscious agents plus a simple, elegant universe, then 3 spatial dimensions is the sweet spot. If you're an atheist, you don't have a good explanation for why the universe has 3 spatial dimensions. And maybe there is no explanation, but I find that doubtful. Yeah. Okay. Let me just sum up with this. I'm not saying that any of these arguments are correct, but I'm saying that these arguments have some merit, and these arguments make me less likely to be an atheist than I would be had I not heard these arguments. And I think that if we want to be intellectually responsible, we should take these arguments seriously and not dismiss them as being products of bad people who are fighting a culture war. Okay, thanks.